January 17th, 1944, Eastern Front. Somewhere along the frozen ridges west of Leningrad. The air tasted of iron and ash. Snow fell in silence over the remnants of a Wehrmacht supply column. 16 burned trucks, their frames blackened and twisted like the fingers of dying men. The cold was absolute. It crept beneath wool, beneath skin, beneath thought itself. In the distance, the low rumble of Soviet artillery echoed across the white expanse, a sound so constant it had become indistinguishable from the pulse of the earth. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann crouched in the shell crater, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of ersatz coffee that had long since frozen solid. His breath came in shallow clouds. His rifle lay across his knees, crusted with ice. He had not eaten in 2 days. Around him, the remnants of his platoon, 11 men out of 40, stared eastward with hollow eyes, waiting for the next assault, waiting for the end. But Hartmann was not thinking about the Russians. He was thinking about the piece of paper folded inside his tunic. A letter from his younger brother, delivered 3 weeks earlier by field post. In it, his brother described the Allied bombing of Hamburg, the firestorm, the streets melted into rivers of asphalt, their mother's body found in the rubble, burned beyond recognition, identified only by the wedding ring still fused to her finger. And at the bottom of the letter, a single line, underlined twice. "They told us you are coming home soon. They are lying." Hartmann did not cry. He had no tears left. But he understood in that moment that surrender was no longer an option. Not because of loyalty, not because of courage, but because there was nowhere left to go. By the winter of 1944, the mythology of the Third Reich had begun to collapse under the weight of its own brutality. For nearly 5 years, the German soldier had been taught to see himself as a crusader, an instrument of a new order, a defender of European civilization against Bolshevism and decadence. The propaganda machine, finely tuned by Goebbels and his apparatus, had painted the war in absolutes, victory or annihilation, glory or shame. The German soldier was not merely a combatant, he was a bearer of destiny. But destiny, as it turned out, had a weight limit. The turning points had come swiftly, one after another, like dominoes toppling in slow motion. Stalingrad, Kursk, the collapse of Army Group Center, the loss of North Africa, the invasions of Sicily and Italy. Each defeat was explained away by Berlin as a tactical adjustment, a temporary setback, a necessary sacrifice. But the men at the front knew better. They had seen the maps. They had watched entire divisions vanish into the snow, into the mud, into the mouths of Soviet Katyushas. They had counted the dead.
And by 1944, they had begun to understand what the war had truly become. Not a campaign of conquest, but a war of survival. Not an expansion of empire, but a defense against judgment. The Red Army was no longer retreating, it was advancing. And behind it came stories that spread through the German ranks like contagion, whispered in bunkers and field hospitals, shared over cold rations in the dead of night. Stories of villages retaken, of German prisoners executed in the streets, of collaborators hanged from lampposts, of soldiers stripped, tortured, left to freeze in open fields. Some of these stories were true. Some were exaggerated. Some were fabrications of the SS propaganda units designed to keep men fighting when reason had long since abandoned them. But the distinction no longer mattered. Fear had replaced ideology, and fear made surrender unthinkable. To understand why German soldiers in 1944 believed they could not lay down their arms, one must first understand what they had been told about the enemy and what they had done in the enemy's land. Since 1941, the Wehrmacht had participated in, or stood witness to, a campaign of extermination unlike anything the modern world had seen. The Einsatzgruppen, the SS, the Order Police, and in some cases regular army units had swept through Eastern Europe like a scythe, executing partisans, Jews, Romani, political commissars, and civilians by the hundreds of thousands. The policies were explicit. Lebensraum required the removal of entire populations. The Hunger Plan, the Commissar Order, the systematic starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, 3 million of whom would die in German custody. Most soldiers did not pull the triggers, but they saw the mass graves. They heard the gunfire at the edge of the villages. They marched past the bodies hanging from telephone poles. And even if they closed their eyes, even if they told themselves it was the work of the SS, the guilt seeped into the soil beneath their boots. By 1944, the men at the front knew that if they were captured, they would not be judged as soldiers. They would be judged as participants, as invaders, as criminals. And the Red Army, they believed, did not take prisoners. This belief was not entirely without foundation. Soviet treatment of German POWs was harsh, often brutal. In the chaos of rapid advances, field executions were not uncommon, particularly of SS personnel and those suspected of war crimes. The Soviets made no secret of their desire for vengeance. Soviet propaganda openly called for retribution. Ilya Ehrenberg, the prominent Soviet war correspondent, wrote in Krasnaya Zvezda, "Kill the German wherever you find him. Kill him in the field, kill him in his house, kill him on the road." The German command weaponized this rhetoric. Officers read excerpts from captured Soviet leaflets aloud to their troops, emphasizing the fate that awaited those who surrendered. Goebbels' propaganda apparatus amplified every verified atrocity, every unverified rumor, until the image of the Soviet soldier became synonymous with barbarism. To surrender, they were told, was to choose torture over death. To surrender was to betray not only the Reich, but oneself. And so the soldier in the trench, exhausted and starving, chose to keep fighting, not because he believed in victory, but because he believed in the inevitability of his own destruction.
But the Red Army was not the only specter haunting the German soldier in 1944. Behind him, to the west, stood an even more terrifying figure, the SS. By this stage of the war, Heinrich Himmler's apparatus had meticulously constructed a system to ensure that no soldier could desert, no unit could retreat, and no man could surrender without facing consequences more immediate than enemy fire. The Feldgendarmerie, military police, patrolled rear areas, hunting for stragglers and deserters. Drumhead courts-martial were convened in field tents, their verdicts delivered in minutes. The punishment was always the same: execution by firing squad, often carried out within the hour. The bodies were left hanging from trees or posts along roadsides, placards around their necks reading, "I was a coward," or "I abandoned my comrades." By the end of the war, the Wehrmacht and SS had executed approximately 15,000 of their own soldiers for desertion, defeatism, or undermining military morale. For comparison, the British Army executed 306 men during the entirety of World War I. The Third Reich executed 15,000 in less than 2 years. The message was unmistakable. Death awaited on both sides of the line. But the death that came from behind was certain, immediate, and humiliating. So the soldier stayed in the trench. He loaded his rifle. He fixed his bayonet. He waited. There was a tin of American corned beef that Hartman found in the wreckage of a supply truck near Vitebsk in March of 1944. It had been airdropped to Soviet partisans and captured by a reconnaissance patrol. The label was printed in English and Russian. Inside, the meat was pressed into perfect geometric squares, glistening fat, preserved in a jelly that smelled faintly of salt and cloves. Hartman shared it with his squad. They ate in silence, slowly, savoring each mouthful. It was the first real meat they had tasted in weeks. When the tin was empty, one of the younger soldiers, a boy from Saxony who had lied about his age to enlist, turned it over in his hands, studying the label. "They send this to the Russians," he said quietly. "This is what they give away." Hartman did not respond, but he understood what the boy was realizing, that the enemy was not starving, that the enemy had so much they could afford to drop crates of food from the sky, that the war they were fighting was not only unwinnable, it was absurd. The tin became a talisman. Hartman carried it in his pack, empty, for the rest of the campaign. It weighed nothing. It meant everything. Because that tin of corned beef represented the thing German propaganda could never reconcile: abundance. The Allies were not depleting their reserves. They were expanding them. Every month, more tanks rolled off American assembly lines, more bombers filled British airfields, more ships crossed the Atlantic. The industrial capacity of the United States alone dwarfed that of the entire Reich, and the soldiers at the front could see it in the wreckage, the serial numbers on destroyed Sherman tanks that climbed higher each week, the markings on captured ammunition crates dated only weeks prior. They were not fighting an enemy, they were fighting a machine.
Surrender, in theory, was simple. Raise your hands, drop your weapon, walk toward the enemy line. But in practice, in the chaos of 1944, it was an act of almost incomprehensible risk. First, there was no guarantee the enemy would accept the surrender. In the heat of battle, recognition of intent was difficult. A soldier stepping from cover with raised hands could easily be mistaken for a combatant. Small unit engagements conducted at close range in ruined cities or dense forests offered little time for judgment. Many who tried to surrender were shot simply because the situation moved too quickly. Second, there was the problem of language. Most German soldiers did not speak Russian or English. The Red Army and Western Allies operated under different procedures for handling POWs, and miscommunication could be fatal. There are documented cases of German soldiers attempting to surrender with improvised white flags, torn shirts, handkerchiefs, only to be fired upon because their gestures were misunderstood, or because enemy troops, traumatized and enraged, simply refused to stop shooting. Third, and perhaps most decisively, there was the knowledge that surrender was not an end, it was a beginning. Soviet POW camps were notorious: starvation, disease, forced labor, interrogations. Of the approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by the Soviets, nearly 1/3 would die in captivity. The last POWs would not be released until 1956, more than a decade after the war's end. And so the calculation was grim: fight and die quickly, or surrender and die slowly. For most, the choice was already made. April 1945, the Seelow Heights, east of Berlin, the final defensive line, the last natural barrier between the Red Army and the capital of the Reich. 500,000 German soldiers, exhausted, undersupplied, many of them Volkssturm conscripts too old or too young for regular service, dug into the ridges, waiting for the storm. It came at dawn on April 16. The Soviets opened with the largest artillery barrage in history, over 9,000 guns firing simultaneously, a sound so loud it could be heard in Berlin, 40 miles away. The ground shook, the sky turned white with fire. For 30 minutes, the world ended and began again. When the barrage lifted, the Soviet infantry advanced behind a wall of searchlights, their beams cutting through the smoke, blinding the defenders. T-34 tanks climbed the slopes, Katyusha rockets screamed overhead. The German line held for 3 days. Then it broke. In the chaos, thousands of German soldiers tried to retreat westward toward the American lines. They had heard the rumors that the Americans treated prisoners well, that they had food, medicine, cigarettes, that surrender to the West meant survival. But between them and the SS stood the SS, and the SS had orders.
Blocking detachments were established along every major road. Any soldier found retreating without written authorization was executed on the spot. In Berlin itself, Volkssturm units manned checkpoints, checking papers, hanging deserters from street lamps. The city became a labyrinth of fear, a place where the only safe direction was forward, into the guns. By the time the Soviets encircled Berlin on April 25th, there was no longer any possibility of escape. The men inside the city fought not because they believed in the Führer, not because they believed in victory, but because there was literally nowhere else to go. The tin of corned beef by then had long since been lost. In the end, the collapse came not as a military defeat, but as a disintegration of meaning. The soldier who had once marched into Poland with songs on his lips, who had stood in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower and believed himself invincible, now crouched in the rubble of his own capital, waiting for the end. He did not understand what he had fought for. He did not understand what he had lost. He knew only that the world he had known, the certainties, the promises, the myths, had been incinerated, and that he was standing in the ashes. Surrender in 1944 was no longer a tactical decision. It was an existential one. It required belief in a future, and for most German soldiers, that future had been annihilated by the very regime they served. So they fought on. Not out of heroism, not out of fanaticism, but out of the simple, terrible logic that when all roads lead to death, the direction no longer matters. And when the guns finally fell silent, when the war ended not with a climax but with a whimper, the survivors stumbled into captivity not as soldiers but as ghosts, men who had seen too much, done too much, lost too much. They carried with them no trophies, no flags, no tin cans, only the knowledge that surrender, in the end, had been the one choice they could not afford to make, until it was the only choice left. In the quiet after the guns, history asks a single question: when does the soldier cease to be a soldier and become a man? The answer, it seems, is the moment he realizes that the flag he carries is a fiction, the orders he follows are a lie, and the cause he serves is a furnace consuming everything he loves. But by then it is too late. The trenches are behind him, the wire is ahead, and between them only the terrible arithmetic of survival. Freedom, it turns out, is not the absence of chains, it is the presence of a choice, and in 1944, on the frozen plains of the East and in the burning cities of the West, the German soldier had none. He had only the war, and the war had no mercy.